Hello, everyone. We are Group 30, and today we'll be presenting on Qantas Airways exposure to exchange rate risk and how the company manages it through financial and operational hedging strategies. My name is Kevin. I'll begin with an overview of Qantas's business model and international operations. Then Ben will discuss the three types of exchange rate risks Qantas faces, followed by Sukman, who will cover financial hedging methods. Yan Wing will explain operational hedging strategies, and Edith will conclude by evaluating the effectiveness of these hedging approaches and suggesting possible alternatives. To start, I will be talking about a high-level overview of the Qantas Group, its operations, network, and product mix. Qantas operates as a diversified aviation group comprising Qantas Domestic, Qantas International, Jetstar, Qantas Link, Qantas Freight, and Qantas Loyalty. Together, these divisions form one of the largest airline networks in the Asia-Pacific region. The group's international routes, such as Perth to Paris, Adelaide to Singapore, and Sydney to Tokyo, expose Qantas to multiple foreign currencies, including the US dollar, euro, yen, and Singapore dollar. These routes are a major source of both revenue and exchange rate exposure. Beyond passenger transport, Qantas also operates freight services and the Qantas Loyalty division, which partners with global financial and retail institutions through the Qantas Points program. These diverse operations mean Qantas earns and spends across several currencies, with most international sales in foreign currency, while domestic operations are primarily in Australian dollars. This multi-currency structure directly links to Qantas's exchange rate risk. A weaker Australian dollar increases the value of foreign currency revenue, but also raises the cost of USD denominated expenses, such as fuel and aircraft leases. Qantas's international reach and diversified operations and mixed currency exposure create a complex foreign exchange risk environment. Now, let's look more closely at the group's financial composition to see exactly how these exposures translate into revenue and cost. In 2025, the Qantas Group generated 23.8 billion Australian dollars in revenue, an 8% increase year on year. Breaking this down by segment, Qantas International contributed 8.6 billion, or 36% of total revenue. Qantas Domestic contributed 7.2 billion, or 30%. Jetstar Group contributed 5.5 billion, around 23%, and Qantas Loyalty added 2.8 billion, or roughly 12%. Each segment faces a different degree of exchange rate exposure. Qantas International earns most of its revenue in foreign currencies, mainly USD, Euro, Japanese yen, and Singapore dollar, while major costs such as fuel and aircraft leases are also USD denominated. So when the Australian dollar weakens, reported revenue rises in Australian dollar terms, but so do those costs, USD costs, creating both transaction and translation exposure. Qantas Domestic operates almost entirely in Australian dollars, acting as a natural hedge that helps stabilize earnings. Qantas Group earns in both Australian dollars and foreign currencies through Jetstar Japan and Jetstar Asia. Local costs in Japanese yen and Singapore dollars offset some of this exposure, forming a natural hedge at the subsidiary level. And Qantas Loyalty earns mostly in Australian dollars, with only modest exposure through global partner programs. Overall, Qantas International, Jetstar, and Loyalty are more sensitive to currency movements, while Qantas Domestic provides balance and stability. Looking at the charts, the pie chart shows each segment's contribution to total revenue, while the bar chart highlights the cost breakdown by currency. About 65% of operating costs in USD, largely from fuel and aircraft leases, 25% in Australian dollars, mainly labor and domestic expenses, and the remainder in Japanese yen and Singapore dollars through Jetstar's overseas bases. This clearly shows a key mismatch, an Australian dollar-based revenue structure against a USD heavy cost base. When the Australian dollar weakens, this will squeeze margins due to the differential. To manage this, Qantas uses both natural hedges such as Jetstar's localized operations and financial hedges like forward contracts and currency options to smooth cash flow volatility and protect profitability. Now that we've seen the size and the nature of these exposures, let's classify them into the three main types of exchange rate risk. This slide categorizes Qantas's exposure into the three main types of exchange rate risk: transaction, translation, and economic. First, transaction risk arises from actual cash flows in foreign currencies, primarily USD payments for jet fuel and aircraft leases, and revenues from international ticket sales. I will reiterate, a weaker Australian dollars increases these USD costs immediately, tightening margins. Second, transaction risk occurs when Qantas consolidates the financial statements of Jetstar Japan and Jetstar Asia, which report in Japanese yen and Singapore dollars. When exchange rates fluctuate, these subsidiaries' earnings change in value when converted to Australian dollars, even if their local performance remains stable. Third, economic risk reflects the long-term impact of currency movements on competitiveness. For example, when the Australian dollar appreciates, inbound tourism becomes more expensive, reducing demand for Qantas International. Conversely, a weaker Australian dollar boosts inbound tourism and export-related travel demand. Together, these risks show that Qantas's FX exposure extends beyond short-term costs. It also affects strategic decisions like fleet acquisition, route planning, and long-term investment. In summary, Qantas faces transaction, translation, and economic exposure that interacts across its global network and cost base. In the next section, Ben will examine each of these risks in greater depth and discuss how they specifically affect Qantas's operation.
Hi, I'm Ben, and I'll be explaining the three types of exchange rate risk: transaction, translation, and economic, and how Qantas is directly affected by these exposures. As Qantas earns and spends money in many currencies, fluctuations in exchange rates have a direct impact on the company's costs, profits, and competitiveness. Looking first at the transaction exposure, this is the short-term risk that changes will occur in exchange rates between the time a transaction is agreed upon and the time it is settled. This arises from fluctuations in the value of contractual obligations, such as foreign currency receivables of payables, that occur between agreement and settlement. As Qantas pays for jet fuel, aircrafts, and outsourced maintenance in US dollars and other foreign currencies while earning large amounts of revenue in Australian dollars, the company is considerably exposed to transaction risk. When the Australian dollar depreciates, every US dollar payment becomes more expensive for the company, increasing operating costs and reducing margins. For example, if the Australian dollar depreciated 1% between the contractual agreement and settlement on the purchase of a new Boeing plane, this could increase the cost for Qantas by over 3 million Australian dollars. It also affects Qantas's revenue. If the Australian dollar strengthens, foreign currency revenue from international ticket sales devalues in Australian dollars, lowering the company's reported income. Transaction risk affects Qantas' short-term cash flows significantly, and the company is highly sensitive to this type of exposure. Translation risk or accounting risk is the exposure caused by fluctuations in exchange rates that affect the value of a company's foreign subsidiaries' assets, liabilities, revenues, and expenses. Qantas is affected by translation exposure due to their numerous foreign subsidiaries, such as Jetstar New Zealand and Japan, and JetConnect, that are all based overseas. Qantas reports its financial statements in Australian dollars, but holds assets and liabilities in foreign currencies. Similar to the effect in transaction risk, when the Australian dollar weakens, the AUD value of these foreign liabilities rises, which in translation inflates the total debt and reduces the net assets. And when the Australian dollar strengthens, the translated value of these foreign earnings devalues, reducing Qantas's profitability in their financial statements, despite the company's actual performance remaining unchanged. As a result of this, investors' perceptions are often altered, affecting stock value and credit metrics, when analysts react to earnings swings that are simply the effect of currency fluctuation. Finally, economic exposure or operating exposure is the sensitivity of a company's cash flows to exchange rate fluctuations, affecting channels such as demand shifts, cost pressures, and competitive dynamics. For Qantas, the strength or weakness of the Australian dollar has significant consequences. When the dollar is strong, it is cheaper for Australians to travel overseas, increasing the demand for outbound travel, while reducing foreign visitor demand. A weak Australian dollar means the opposite, reducing outbound tourism, increasing inbound tourism, but also increasing the costs for all imported fuel, aircraft, and technology. For example, Qantas's fuel bill in the financial year 2024 rose 17% to 5.3 billion Australian dollars, with this rise due to various factors, one of those being the weakness of the Australian dollars. With international aviation markets being intensely competitive, currency fluctuations also affect Qantas's position with carriers such as Emirates or Singapore Airlines, whose cost bases are in different currencies, with a weak Australian dollar meaning Qantas becomes more costly. In summary, Qantas's short term contractual agreements are affected by transaction exposure, their financial results affected by translation exposure, and their long term competitiveness and profitability affected by economic exposure. These exchange rate risks make financial hedging strategies a critical issue for Qantas's performance. I'll now pass it on to Sukhman to discuss how Qantas employs these financial hedging strategies.
Hey, my name's Sukhman, and I'll now explain how Qantas uses forward contracts to stabilize significant cost exposures, particularly towards fuel and USD denominated expenses. In financial year 2023 to 24, Qantas's fuel bill jumped 17% to about $5.32 billion. This is driven by higher consumption, sustainable aviation fuel costs, and global energy price pressures. For the first half of financial year 2024 to 25, the company expects fuel costs, including hedging and carbon costs, to be roughly 2.7 billion Australian dollars. Because so much of Qantas's cost base is aircraft leases, maintenance contracts, parts, and fuel procurement, it has a lot of USD exposure, and fluctuations in the AUD/USD exchange rate pose significant risk to them. To partially reduce that risk, Qantas enters forward contracts that lock in a future exchange rate for transactions expected in 6 to 12 months. For example, Qantas records fuel and foreign exchange derivatives in its financials. As of 30 June 2024, these derivatives collectively were a net asset of $202 million under hedge accounting. The main benefit is predictability. By locking in the exchange rates and fuel costs ahead, Qantas reduces volatility in its cost base. That gives management better visibility for budgeting, pricing decisions, and protecting profit margins against adverse currency or fuel swings. In this slide, I'll explain how Qantas uses currency options and collars to hedge its fuel and USD cost exposures while retaining some flexibility. For the first half of financial year 2026, Qantas targets 83% fuel hedging through a mix of outright options and collars. This shows how central their role is in the hedge program. Options let Qantas set a floor or a cap to protect against a weaker Australian dollar, while they can still benefit if the currency strengthens. This offers downside protection without losing upside potential. This flexibility comes at a cost. Options require premiums and their time value fluctuates. In financial year 25, Qantas recorded a net $90 million loss in its hedge reserve from changes in option time value. So while options do provide control and flexibility, they add cost, complexity, and accounting volatility, which is why Qantas combines them with the forwards and collars rather than relying on them alone. Qantas uses currency swaps to manage longer term and mid term USD debt exposure to align liabilities with its AUD revenue base. Because so much of its debt is in USD, a weaker Australian dollar increases repayment costs. Through cross-currency swaps, Qantas exchanges USD interest and principal flows for Australian dollar. This effectively turns foreign currency debt into a local currency obligation. In financial year 2024, Qantas reported FX derivatives, including swaps, as a net asset of $202 million, showing how favorable the hedge value is. However, the accounting rules can be complex, and not all swaps qualify as cash flow hedges, means some gains and losses go through a profit or loss. Qantas must also manage counterparty basis and residual currency risks to maintain hedge effectiveness. Despite their benefits, derivatives come with key challenges. 1. Forecast risk. Hedging is only as accurate as fuel use and underlying currency forecasts. 2. Opportunity cost. Locked in contracts can mean missing gains if the Australian dollar strengthens. 3. Cost and accounting impact. Premiums, fees, and hedge effectiveness testing all add expense and earnings volatility. 4. Counterparty and basis risk. Banks may default or positions may not perfectly match exposures. And then 5. Liquidity strain. Collateral or margin calls can tie up cash. In short, Qantas balances these costs, risks, and accounting pressures to sustain a consistent, effective hedging program. I'll now hand over to Yan, who'll discuss Qantas's operational hedging strategies.
Operational hedge. One key strategy is matching revenues and costs in same currency. Qantas' major cost fuel aircraft leases are often priced in US dollar. In 2025, fuel cost was $5 billion, 23% of total expenditure. On revenue side, Qantas earned $5.5 billion from international market. This revenue includes US ticket sales in US dollar. Qantas can have a hedge by using US dollar revenues to cover US dollar costs. Qantas also incur operational costs in other currency. Qantas can match local ticket sales revenue to local operational costs such as airport charge. Aligning revenues and costs in same currency, Qantas can partially offset foreign currency exposure. There are two advantages. First, reduce foreign currency fluctuation. If Australian dollar weakens, US dollar costs are higher, However, Qantas US dollar ticket sales revenue go up. This will partially offset the rise in US dollar costs. Second, Qantas can reduce reliance on costly finance derivative. However, there are some disadvantages. First, imperfect hedge. Revenue and cost timing may not always align due to seasonal factor. Second, demand risk. If demand for US flight routes weaken, or Qantas may earn less US dollar revenues. However, major US dollar costs like aircraft leases remain fixed. Qantas may still face foreign currency risks. Diversifying operation. Geographic diversification. Qantas can diversify operation across multiple countries, expanding flight routes in different countries. Qantas can generate income in multiple currency. Cost diversification. Qantas can diversify cost base across multiple countries. For example, by sourcing maintenance service in different currency zones, Qantas can reduce dependence on any single currency. The advantage is risk diversification. Qantas can diversify revenues and costs across multiple countries and currency. This reduces company exposure to any single currency. Qantas can maintain operational flexibility by adjusting flight routes between markets. So Qantas can respond quickly to changing currency and demand. There are some disadvantages. Imperfect hedge. When Australian dollar weak, additional revenues earned in stronger foreign currency like Japanese yen or euro may not be sufficient to fully offset increased US dollar costs. Also, expanding overseas operation requires significant investment. Leading and lagging. Leading info accelerating payment when a currency expect to rise. If Qantas expect US dollar to rise, it may choose to pay US dollar costs earlier. This reduces the risk of paying more Australian dollar later. Lagging means delaying payment when a currency is expected to weak. If Qantas expect US dollar to fall, it may delay US dollar payment to benefit from paying fewer Australian dollar. The advantages include cost saving, adjusting time of payment based on currency expectation to reduce transactional costs. Disadvantage. First, require accurate currency expectation. If the currency move opposite to the expectation, it will increase the cost. Second, opportunity cost of making early payment is losing potential interest income. I now pass it on to Edith to discuss the effectiveness of the hedging strategy.
Hi, I'm Edith, and I'm going to continue with the effectiveness of Qantas hedging strategy and some recommendation. For an airlines like Qantas, change in the value of money create huge risks. So how do they protect themselves? They use a two-part plan. First is financial hedging. They use a tool like forward contract to lock in the price for new planes. This gives them the cost certainty. They also use currency option as safety plans for fuel costs, which give them more flexibility. The second part is operational hedging. This is their foundation. They match the US dollars they earn from the tickets to their US dollar costs. They also diversify their routes across many countries to spread out the risk. So how well does this plan actually work? It has some clear strengths but also some major weaknesses. The main strength is cost certainty. Locking price allows Qantas to plan for the future with confidence. The operational hedging also create a natural buffer that reduces risk without extra cost. However, the biggest weakness is forecasting risk. The plan rely on guessing future demand. If they guess wrong, like during the pandemic, they can lose a lot of money on hedge they don't need. The plan's also an imperfect hedge because the revenue is unpredictable. Finally, hedging it has high costs, both in fees and in missed opportunity for saving. So the strategy is powerful, but it's also very rigid and can be costly. This brings us to our recommendation. Qantas can improve its strategy by making three key changes. First, adopt advanced hedging instrument. They should use more flexible tools that protect them from the losses, but still let them benefit from good currency move. Second, implement a dynamic hedging framework. They should adjust how much they hedge based on the market conditions. This means hedging more in risky term and less in calm term. Finally, align financing with earnings. They should borrow money in the same currency where they can earn money, like getting a euro loan to match the European ticket sales. This create a perfect natural balance. By making these changes, Qantas turn its hedging plans from just a business cost into a real strategic advantage. The shift from thinking hedging is just a cost to using it as a smart tool to create value. This will make Qantas more agile, more profitable, and a stronger company for the future. And that's it, the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.